Welcome to the Stantec Water webinar series. Today's session features lead and copper rule experts Brendan O'Brien, Caitlin Glover, and Sean Spath. They will discuss lead and copper rule improvements, regulatory uncertainty, and future actions for water utilities. I am Heather Dean, your hostess. During the session, you will be in listen-only mode. We invite you to submit questions at any time during the presentation by selecting the Q&A icon in the top panel of your screen. Your questions will be addressed following the presentation. And with that, let's get started.
Awesome. Thank you, Heather. I'm going to turn my camera off for the time being, and then we'll come back on at the end for the Q&A. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We have a great webinar to present on how to navigate regulatory uncertainty on the lead and copper rule improvements. So to get started, we're going to launch a poll to gauge for folks on the line how many unknowns you submitted in your initial inventories last October. So as you are filling out that poll, we want to acknowledge that there are a lot of acronyms used when we discuss the lead and copper rule improvements. So our panelists, we're gonna aim to use the full terminology, but we are also providing this as a link in the Q&A panel for reference throughout the presentation. So at Stantec, we start all meetings with a Stantec moment. Today, I want to briefly discuss the importance of sleep, since a few of us, may or may not be losing sleep over meeting LCRI compliance. So just some key things to note. Getting enough sleep is vital for your mind and body. It allows you to recharge and also boost your immune system. Obviously, everyone's sleep needs vary, but experts recommend getting about 8 hours a night for adults, with children needing more. So you can see here listed a couple other tips to get a better night's sleep. So here's our panelist today. My name is Brendan O'Brien. I'm a project manager with Stantec out of this Tampa, Florida office. I also serve as our company's lead and copper rule leader. We also have here with us Dr. Caitlin Glover. She's a senior environmental designer out of the Pasadena, California office. We also have Sean Spath, who is our state revolving fund manager out of our Albany, New York office. So for today's agenda, we're going to be walking you through the current landscape of regulatory uncertainty. We will then get into a few of the LCRI components, including service line inventory, replacement planning. We're going to get into the nuances around sampling and monitoring, and then how to best tackle funding opportunities. We're going to finish with some major takeaways and some time at the end for Q&A. I do want to mention that late last year, this is something folks may have heard. Late last year, the EPA did release some helpful fact sheets around a number of the LCRI elements. So during this presentation, our panel might make reference to those. And so our host is going to be dropping a link in now to the Q&A panel where you can find those fact sheets. So a little bit about regulatory transition. So the lead and copper rule, it originated in 1991, which has required utilities to sample for lead and copper levels throughout their system. The rule underwent major changes in 2021 with the lead and copper rule revisions, which had an effective date of October 16, 2024. So, and during that time between 2021 and 2024, the focus for public water systems has primarily been developing your initial service line inventories and preparing for the first year of customer notifications, which hopefully went out last November. However, on October 8th, the LCRI was released by the EPA, and on October 30th, it was made official in the Federal Register. Essentially, this replaced the LCRR in its entirety, the exception of the 4 retained elements showed on the right side of this slide. So to summarize, we're still complying with the lead and copper rule of 1991, plus the 4 elements that were retained from the LCRR shown here. And that is now taking place until November 1st, 2027. And so we're going to take you through some of the most important pieces to ensure you're meeting compliance. To set the stage a bit, in December 2024, the American Water Works Association, they petitioned the LCRI, and that petition really focused on 3 components, those being the legality of service line replacements on private property, the affordability for utility owners, and also the feasibility of a 10-year replacement schedule. Additionally, Congress has the ability to rescind elements of the LCRI, since this was a rule that was published and implemented within 60 days of a presidential change. So similar to what happened with the PFAS rule, the court is now reviewing the LCRI. We also know that there's a coalition of at least 11 state attorneys that are supporting the LCRI. So there's pull on both sides. We also know that the next congressional session is coming up July 1st. We have heard from folks in the industry that there might be more news available after that date. There might be some decisions made. We're going to keep you informed soon on that. Now, I think it's extremely key to note what happened most recently with that PFAS rule that I just mentioned. Folks on the line, you may or may not be aware, but for those that are unfamiliar, it underwent proposed changes where the intent is to keep 2 of the 5 maximum contaminant levels for PFOS and PFOA. The other 3 and the hazard index, they could technically be reconsidered, but as of now, they are simply rewriting the rule for just those 2. There's also the intent to extend compliance deadline from 2029 to 2031. So as you can see, already some precedent set. So the LCRI regulations could change in some way, shape, or form. Regardless of really what happens, though, there are still components that are in both the LCRR and LCRI that you need to comply with. We also just want to make a keynote here that there are industry experts, including AWWA staff, that are still recommending that utility owners push forward to meet LCRI compliance as it is written today to best position themselves for the future. So here is probably a somewhat familiar graphic to folks listening in today. This is a timeline of the LCRR and LCRI components. I want to bring your attention towards more of the middle of the screen. We're going to be really focusing on the elements that go into effect or are due on November 1st, 2027, and then shortly thereafter on January 1st, 2028. So this is a key slide here. So what is definite? What do you have to do no matter what happens at the regulatory level with the rule? You can see the elements that you must comply with. You still need to submit a replacement plan. You still need to go through with a revised sampling plan. You still need to undergo that schools and daycares testing program, and you still need to perform sampling for the first and fifth liters at sites that are served by a lead service line. Also key to note, if you are a system that doesn't even have any lead GRR unknowns, right? So you're considered a non-lead system. You still need to comply with some of these elements, such as the schools and childcare's testing and the necessary tap sampling changes, which Caitlin will speak about in a little bit. So recommended immediate actions. This is, again, a slide you're going to see towards the end of our presentation to regroup on, but these are just our 5 key takeaways that we want you to really hammer in during this presentation. So first, make sure you're focusing on reducing unknowns in your inventory. This can be done in a variety of ways, which might include field investigations. You could use predictive modeling, statistical analysis, just important things there. You should also be working with your regulators for available funding. Funding might still be available, so make sure you're working with your states. Sean will go into the details on that piece later on. Consider standing up a schools and daycare sampling program prior to 2028. You can begin now. You don't have to wait until 2028. By getting ahead of this, you can certainly save yourself some headaches down the road. Evaluate first and fifth liter sampling at your sampling sites. Caitlin will go into a little bit more on details on that later in the presentation. And lastly, make sure you're adding connectors to your baseline inventory. This is one of the requirements. Again, we will touch upon this a little bit more in detail later on. So these are the 4 elements that we're going to take you through: service line inventory, service line replacement. We're going to hit deeply on the sampling and monitoring, and then Sean will take us home with funding. So getting into it, getting into the service line inventory here. The baseline inventory, it's probably one of the main focuses that people are working on right now towards the next compliance deadline of, again, that November 1st, 2027. As I just mentioned, you're required to add connector materials to each of your service line inventories. This material can be unknown, but as you come across them, you need to be documenting them. You also have to undergo the records review process for connectors, extremely similar to what you did prior for service lines in your inventory. So if this is something you didn't initially do while documenting your service lines during that initial period, you need to go through this process again, strictly for connectors. Probably the most important thing to mitigate, or to do, is to mitigate as many unknowns as possible. Prior to November 2027, I'll get into a little bit details on why, the reasons behind that. Just a few other things to note. Just like the initial inventory, if you're a system greater than 50,000 customers, your baseline inventory also needs to be made available to the public. So same thing there. And then one other final nuance that I don't think most people are aware of, but after this is published, November 1st, 2027, if a customer disagrees with the material that is listed in your inventory, you as the utility owner, you have 30 days to respond, confirm the material, and right, so you can imagine that that's obviously going to be a use of time and resources. Just one little quick thing to note, there is a fact sheet that goes along with this. It details more into the weeds on the service line inventory and replacement requirements. So why do we want to reduce our unknowns so badly? Well, on an annual basis, you must send letters annually to all customers that have a lead service line, a galvanized requirement replacement service line, or an unknown. You also need to submit your inventory annually to your state regulatory agency if you have at least one LSL, a GRR, or an unknown. You are also required to submit a service line replacement plan, again, if you have at least one LSL, GRR, or unknown. Additionally, unknowns also count towards your replacement rate. So come November 2027, your replacement rate is calculated by taking the amount of lead service lines, GRRs, plus your unknowns, and dividing that by 10, right? So that becomes your yearly replacement rate. If you have a lot of unknowns, you can imagine that number would skyrocket. Lastly, you are required to offer sampling to homes that are served by an LSL, a GRR, or an unknown service line, which could result in a pretty big financial burden for some utilities. So just for scalability, for example, if you're a system that has, let's say, 10,000 service lines and you have no lead, maybe you don't even have GRR, but 9,000 of those 10,000 are unknowns, then you are required to offer sampling to 9,000 of your customers. So you can imagine what kind of headaches that would bring. Again, just another major reason to really be focusing on reducing your unknowns prior to that 2027 compliance deadline. Okay, so I just told you that you should be focusing on reducing unknowns, but how do you do it? Well, here's one way we're going to go through that we think is very valuable. I'm sure you've heard the recent buzzwords of predictive modeling, statistical analysis. So before I get into this, first I want to mention that each state is different in their guidance. So the last time I checked, 34 states, they had published guidance and they did accept predictive modeling as a method. There were 3 other states that were pending federal guidance, so it looks like they were working towards publishing something. And then the remaining 13 states, well, they didn't have any issued guidance, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those states don't accept it as a method for categorization. And so going through this process at a high level, the first step you do, shown in these orange circles here, right? You're gonna perform your data ingestion. You likely did this in your initial inventory. You're gonna pull in data from available sources. You know, this could include work orders, billing system data, previously field verified data. You're going to take that information and you're going to run it through a model. And you can initially perform some preliminary predictions that can be done on that data. Again, it depends on the value of it, but you have the ability to reduce some unknowns right off the bat. Might be a lot, might be a little, might be none, right? It all depends on the type of data. After this, a list of representative inspection locations can be produced. So in order for a statistically valid model to work, the addresses do have to be random and representative of the system. So you can't just go begin inspecting, 100 service lines on one street and plug that information in. It's not going to work. They need to be representative. So that is what is indicated here by the blue square. The next step is to actually do those inspections, right? So make sure you're capturing the data using proper software so that engineers or GIS staff can QA/QC that information on the back end. So we're making sure we're feeding these models the accurate information. So on the top, going up towards the no lead area. So if you don't find any lead, you can use what's called a statistical analysis. This allows you to reclassify your unknowns to potentially non-lead. Going on the bottom route, if you have lead in your system, then a predictive model can be built on the data in which it will predict the probability of lead at all addresses in the service area. So, and then to enhance the model, you may have to perform a couple rounds of field investigations for those best results. So that is what is indicated there by the blue dashed lines. Once that is done, you are then able to reclassify your materials based on certain thresholds. That's a fairly complex thing, and that you then proceed with documenting and reporting the process and submitting to your state regulator to eventually meet compliance. So I just mentioned a lot about field inspections. So you may be asking, well, how many do I need to do? So based on documentation published by most states and the EPA, the number does range somewhere between 300 to 400. It really depends on the size of your system. So you can see here the left column represents the number of unknown service lines. The right column indicates the number of field inspections that are needed. I do think the major takeaway from this, though, is no matter how big your system is, you can perform under 400 inspections and significantly decrease your unknowns leveraging using models. So I'm now going to take us through two case studies. The first is using that first approach, the statistical analysis approach. These are real clients and real numbers. This first example is a pretty large utility, right? Over 181,000 service line connections. This utility, they have a lot of newer communities, but there are also a lot of locations that were in downtown areas that were built in the early 1900s. So after we pulled the county data, looked at the year built, we were left with 28,000 private side unknowns, 15,000 public side unknowns. So we had our work cut out for us. Before working with this client, the client initially, they performed 245 field verifications of their own. So we augmented that with an additional 345 plus or minus inspections on both the public and private side that were representative of the system. These results, you can see here on the right, they showed a lot of plastic, a good chunk of galvanized, some copper, some other materials. But long story short, in the end, we did not encounter lead. The client and all their staff members, they informed us that they'd never seen a lead service line, right? And so at the end of the day, we used statistical analysis, and we were able to say with 95% confidence that there's a less than 0.01 probability of any service line being lead, which allowed us to reclassify those two non-lead. And ultimately, we were able to submit a fully non-lead initial inventory, and that utility did not need to send out any letters last November. So next case study, a little more complex here. This involves building a predictive model. So this system, they had very little lead. They were in a metropolitan city of about 75,000 service connections. So good size there. Looking at the data, we were able to label 10,000 buildings as non-lead since they were built after the lead ban date. So that left us with 65,000 unknowns, right? So I think another key thing to note is that this utility, they didn't have very good records, specifically for service lines. So this is where we said, okay, we need to look at doing some targeted field work and utilizing a predictive model. So what we did is we ended up performing a substantial modeling program. We obtained material on the public side, the private side. We also looked at the goosenecks in some instances. So we excavated around 460 sites. The utilities crews also augmented that with about another 20 from doing emergency operations, fixing leaks, stuff of that nature. At the end of the day, the field results yielded about 15% galvanized. You can see here in the chart that the majority of the materials were plastic and copper. And we did find very, very few lead. I think it was around 2 or 3 at this time, all centered in the downtown area. Now, because we only found a few lead service lines, I want to note that this is kind of a worst case scenario when you're getting into these programs. The reason being is because it makes building a predictive model pretty difficult. It's hard to predict where something is if you only have very, very minimal of it. But at the end of the day, after enhancing the model, we did end up with reducing that number to 42,000 unknowns plus GRRs. We were predicting GRR as well. So this ended up resulting in 42,000 letters, right? Again, down from 65K. Now, 42,000 letters, that definitely seems like a lot. But in the grand scheme of things, right, it resulted in a 50% reduction from what we started with. So Again, just a reminder, this was kind of a worst case scenario. Most models are built using better data. So just goes to show how much value these models can bring. Since then, in 2025, we've also done additional potholing. Again, these predictive models even more enhanced. They've been able to reduce the customer notifications down by another 10,000. So we sit now at 32,000 today. It's also worth mentioning that this is one of those 13 states that didn't have actual guidance yet for predictive modeling, right? So we met with the state regulators a couple times. We stepped them through our approach. They told us it was acceptable. So this is, again, just another example of how maintaining communication with your state can really help you reach compliance. I also want to note the predictive modeling process. It's pretty complex. In building a model, there's something like 130 attributes that get spatially joined. So this would require, a whole other separate webinar to get into the weeds. But if anyone's interested in learning more, please make sure you reach out to us. Moving forward onto service line replacement. So I'm going to quickly touch base on this. So who needs to submit a service line replacement plan? Well, again, any system that has at least one LSL-GRR unknown. When does that need to be due by? As I mentioned before, November 1st, 2027. How often these be done? Well, you submit that November 1st and then annually thereafter. So the next submission would be January 30th, 2029, 2030, 2031, et cetera. And then where do they need to be hosted? As I mentioned before, these need to also be publicly accessible. So what goes into your replacement plan? Well, a lot of elements. These aren't just quick documents, quick and short documents. They need to include a lot of different things. You can see the laundry list here. Some things include, standing operating procedures, a really detailed funding strategy, particularly for the private side replacements, a communication strategy, et cetera. So this is definitely something you can begin developing now. You don't need to wait until 2027. I would urge people to start thinking about this now. And so with that, I'm going to send it to Caitlin to bring us to talk about some sampling and monitoring.
Great. Thanks so much, Brendan. So as I start this section, you'll notice another poll pop up. Please take a moment to fill that out, and I'll wait here for a few moments just to give you time to read through that and submit it. All right. Thanks everyone for putting your results in there. So like Brendan mentioned, I'm going to be talking through the sampling and monitoring changes that we're going to see under the LCRR and the LCRI. We're considering that there are 3 components of these sampling and monitoring changes. So that includes changes to our TAP monitoring. There's also changes in the customer transparency piece. So that includes things like public outreach and public education. And then there's also going to be an expansion in the required sampling to include schools and childcare facilities that are served by the system. So under the TAP monitoring category, there's actually changes to where samples need to be collected. Under the LCRR and LCRI, there's a refocus to sampling at sites with lead service lines. And if possible, all your samples need to be collected from lead service lines. And again, this kind of just goes back to what Brendan was saying, that it's really important to complete your inventory to understand what you have in your system. Under the LCRI, there will also be an expansion to the types of systems that need to follow this prioritization. So we'll go from just community water systems that need to follow this, and then under the LCRI, that would be expanded to include non-transient, non-community water systems. What remains unchanged is the number of sites that need to be collected. So this is still based on the size of your system. So specifically when we're talking about these new tiers, we'll see there are new definitions and an expansion from 3 tiers to 5 tiers. Previously, we were prioritizing sites that had copper pipe with lead solder based on specific installation dates. But now under the LCRR and LCRI, we'll have 5 tiers with these new definitions that you can see on the slide here. The first two include single-family and multifamily homes with lead service lines. Tiers 3 to 5 are different from the original 3 tiers, and one thing that you'll notice is that none of these categories include a date of installation. A couple of other details to note for sampling. Across both the LCR, LCRR, and LCRI, the same approach should be taken with respect to exhausting samples from the highest tier before moving on to a lower one. And again, like I mentioned, if possible, all sites should be collected from tier 1. One exception to this is if your system has 20% that serves multifamily residences, then the system can include these as tier 1. Lastly, when you go to redefine your sites, if possible, try and collect at the same sites that you've been using previously. So in addition to site selection, a second piece of the sampling that will change is the way you collect tier 1 and tier 2 samples. So specifically, you must now collect the first and fifth liter. So again, that's for the homes that have lead service lines. And under the LCRI, the sample with the higher value of the 2 liters must be used in your 90th percentile calculation. What we know is that that fifth liter may contain higher levels of lead. So in this example, the fifth liter has 8 parts per billion and the first liter has 3 parts per billion. We think it's going to be really important to collect these samples early, perhaps to complete a pilot program to better understand the impact that this additional liter will have on your 90th percentile calculation. This is especially true because it coincides with the changes in the lead action level, reducing that level down to 10 parts per billion. Some other changes to the sampling include the fact that cleaning or removing aerators is prohibited, and samples must be collected in a wide mouth bottle. Under the LCRI, this size is defined as a minimum opening of 40 millimeters. Some pieces of the LCR remain unchanged for sample collection. So this includes the single liter collection for copper and for homes without lead service lines. Similarly, you'll keep that 6-hour stagnation period in place. One additional change under the LCRR is that if the sample results are above the action level, results must be provided to customers with 3 days. Of course, this can prove challenging when samples might be collected near the end of the work week. Under the LCRI, this public notification piece extends to all samples collected, regardless of type or result. That notice can go out by email, phone, mail, hand, or any other method that's approved by the state. So let's go through an example of how you might select sites and which values you might use under the LCRI. In this example, the utility needs to collect 60 samples, but they don't have enough tier 1 and tier 2 sites. So just a reminder, these tier 1 and tier 2 are those served by lead service lines. So they can fill the remaining number of their samples with tier 3, but they won't know which specific samples go into that 90th percentile calculation until they get the results back. So to calculate the 90th percentile, using the results from tiers 1 to 3, they would select the highest concentrations observed. And specifically for tier 1 and tier 2 samples, this would be the higher value from the first or fifth liter sample results. So this is one example that we're providing here. It's present in the US EPA fact sheet. If this doesn't meet with what your system has, please reach out or look to the other examples that are provided in the fact sheet linked on this slide. So for sampling frequency with the LCRR, the systems that would be impacted are those that are above that trigger level, where they'd no longer be eligible for reduced sampling at a reduced number of sites, and would go back to annual sampling at the standard number of sites. If the LCRI is kept as it is, beginning in 2028, any system with lead and/or galvanized requiring replacement will revert back to standard monitoring on a semi-annual basis. Similarly, if your system is above the revised action level of 10 parts per billion for lead, you must also revert back to standard monitoring for at least 2 consecutive 6-month tap sampling periods. However, if you've already been following the updated LCRI sampling protocol with the new tiers and the new bottles, it would be possible for you to continue with a reduced sampling program. So there is some incentive there for you to start these programs early so that you can continue on that reduced monitoring program. Moving on to the customer transparency piece of the regulations. So under the LCRR, there are updates in the public notification, public education, and the consumer confidence report to include lead health effects language. In addition, translations must be available upon request if a large proportion of your water system contains customers with limited English proficiency. Under the LCRI, that lead health effect language will remain, but you must also offer additional testing for any customer that's served by a lead, galvanized requiring replacement, or lead status unknown line. So like Brendan mentioned, it's another reason to get that inventory going. Another type of sampling that must be offered is to collect a sample between 3 and 6 months after a partial or full replacement. Lastly, there are changes to the actions systems must take if they exceed that lead action level multiple times. And one of the major changes is that systems must offer to install and maintain filters for customers affected. So what are the changes that are happening to the consumer confidence report? Many of you may already be familiar with these changes because the due date is in about 2 weeks, but I'll quickly go through them. So the consumer confidence report must include information about the service line inventory and where to access it. It must include the range of results for lead and copper from your most recent sampling. It must include information on the availability of lead sampling data and show customers where they can access it. And then lastly, it must have that new lead health effects language. And on this slide and in the Q&A panel, you can find a link to that lead health language. So on to the last piece of sampling and monitoring. All systems need to perform lead sampling in schools and licensed childcare facilities starting in 2028. So before we discuss the sampling requirements, I just want to spend a little bit of time on the definitions of different schools because there are different sampling requirements for these different categories. So a childcare facility is a location that houses a provider of childcare, daycare, or early learning services. And just to emphasize, this is a licensed facility. Elementary schools can be comprised of any span of grades, including preschool, but they must not be above grade 8. Lastly, a secondary school similarly can comprise any span of grades that follows that elementary school in the system, but ending at grade 12. So this might include junior high schools, it might include just a senior high school, but again, it will end at grade 12. So for elementary schools and licensed childcare facilities, 20% of these must be sampled starting in 2028. The results and public education materials must be provided to each facility. In addition, your CCR will need to include a statement about the opportunity for these schools to be sampled. So what does that sampling upon request look like? In the first 5 years, all secondary schools are eligible for the requested sampling. And then starting after those first 5 years, any school served by the system would be eligible for this sampling. There are some exceptions to this. So any facility that's constructed after 2014 or those sampled after 2024 would be excluded from the need to sample. And just as a heads up, there is a grant funding program under the Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation Act that provides, and this program provides funding for voluntary sampling programs. School boards can take advantage of this, but they might not be aware of it. So please see the link in the Q&A panel to learn more details on that program. And then Sean will also touch on this a little bit more later. So in summary, in terms of sampling and monitoring, we are considering these three components. And on this slide here, we just have a few suggestions under each to keep in compliance with the LCRR and LCRI. So for tap monitoring, it's really important to know your new sites that you're going to use under that new 5-tier system. And also consider that 5th leader pilot program because we know it can impact your 90th percentile level. In terms of customer transparency, you want to be ready for that increased sample load that might be present from requested samples. And you also want to make sure you have translated materials available. So start working with your communications department to get those ready. Lastly, for schools and childcare facilities, you might just consider reaching out to school boards or departments to begin that coordination for future sampling. And with that, I will turn it over to Sean to discuss the funding piece.
Thanks, Caitlin. Before we talk a little bit more about funding, we're going to drop one last poll to ask if you and your utility have applied yet for funding for your lead compliance programs. All right, you can go to that next slide, Caitlin. The first step in the funding process for your lead service line replacement program is really to establish needs and program goals. Funding conversations should begin up front alongside early planning to align with timelines and expectations right from the jump with internal and external partners. Coordination with your LCRI team and stakeholders should continue beyond that early planning conversation, really in order to stay in sync with technical teams and milestones. We'll keep funding requests timely and targeted to some of the big upcoming actions for your program. The next step in the process is where the rubber starts to meet the road a bit. Identify current funding capacity of your utility that is available for your lead service line replacement program by asking what funds are available now, where is this money coming from, have all these costs been budgeted and put in our CIP, and if so, how much? These questions will better position utilities to assess what funding gaps do exist. And finally, the last step that we'll focus a little more on today is addressing those funding needs. There are many different ways to close these funding gaps within your program, and a well-rounded, proactive approach will greatly improve your readiness to move from planning all the way through to replacement. So once you have figured out your funding goals and taken stock of your current finances and what's available, addressing funding needs starts with understanding what funding sources are out there and which ones your lead service line replacement program qualifies for. How to stack these programs to support planning, inventory replacement is a big piece of this. A solid funding strategy usually pulls from the 4 major categories that you see here to build that stack. Out of all these funding sources, the lead service line replacement funding offered through your state SRF is without a doubt the most significant in this space. The bipartisan infrastructure law set aside $15 billion in 2021 in federal funding specifically for lead service line replacement use. Now, because this is all allocated through each individual SRF program, every state will handle this program differently and the administration of these funds a little differently, but the eligible use of funds remain the same. These funds are for loans to funding all phases of the lead service line replacement process, planning, inventory, and replacement, and include a requirement of 49% of this funding to be used for principal forgiveness to borrowers. And despite these attractive terms, which are great, lead service line funding also is not without its challenges. These programs are often pay-as-you-go efforts with some difficulty in pinning down total costs and maneuvering the many unknowns along the way. Additionally, funding through the SRF cannot be used directly to assist with private residences, and their responsibilities with forces utilities to seek alternative, creative approaches to help customers cooperate and execute a replacement on their own property. And lastly, ongoing coordination required within a lead service line replacement effort can get complicated with the sheer number of parties involved during inventory and replacement. All of these really should be considered before pursuing any type of funding, SRF or outside the SRF. And while LCRI funding may be the most prevalent in the lead service line replacement funding strategy and within this space, it's certainly not the only available resource for utilities. To build a well-rounded approach, utilities should actively look beyond their SRF programs for additional sources that can complement or even enhance existing funding. A great place to start is grants. At the federal level, programs like CDBG entitlements and the WIN grants have supported lead service line funding efforts nationwide and work well with SRF dollars. And additionally, state level grants. Though these can vary a bit, they can be just as important and critical to your funding strategy. States like New York offer long-standing programs like their WIFIA and IMG grants that are a great fit for lead service line replacement, while others like Michigan and Colorado have carved out grants specifically for lead service line planning and support. So you can also work with local regional agencies too to tap into existing allocations or look to become a subrecipient on larger funding requests. And finally, for larger projects, the EPA WIFIA program is really another strong financing option. It's a federal credit assistance program designed for large water infrastructure projects, typically over 25 million, that offer borrowers extremely flexible market rate credit. A WIFIA loan can fund up to 49% of total project costs and allows utilities to bundle projects or even put forward full capital programs, while also allowing for deferred payments to align with future revenue expectations. And for all these reasons, the WIFIA program really continues to grow as a pillar of the federal water infrastructure funding strategy. So here, we'll take a quick look at what different funding strategies for your lead service line program could actually look like in practice. As you can see, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. The stacking of different funding sources can happen in all different kinds of ways using a mix of funding tools. The top left example here shows an ideal scenario where your program is 100% funded through the SRF dedicated lead service line dollars. This has been done in many states and many projects that I've seen, but in reality, a lot of states may not have the capacity to fund the full utility needs in a given year for a funding request. So when that happens, there's plenty of other ways to try to fill this gap. The top middle and top right examples show partial SRF funding paired with a combination of local cash as well as grant awards. And the bottom left graphic here shows an example of how utilities can combine their lead service line work into a larger project or in a larger SRF application that may have already been planned to improve efficiency and have a request that pulls from both the general SRF funding pot as well as from the lead service line allocation within their state program. And for large-scale projects, WIFIA, as I mentioned, continues to be another option that has the appropriate funding capacity and flexibility for your lead service line program. Oftentimes, WIFIA projects will utilize SRF funding as a co-funding mechanism alongside potentially other debt issued by the utility. But if SRF funding is not attainable or available for a given reason, lead service line replacement projects can still be funded through that 51% or 49% covered by the WIFIA program alongside other municipal funding sources, as you can see in that bottom right strategy there. So as many of you may know, there's been a lot of movement lately when it comes to federal funding and a steady stream of updates from Congress. So the question is, what does this all mean for lead service line replacements and for funding? The $15 billion that was initially invested for this use in 2021 was planned through 2026. However, there's now a lot of question marks that have come about regarding the future of this funding and where it lands within the federal budget moving forward. At the end of last year, a continuing resolution was passed by Congress that kept 2025 funding levels the same as 2024 funding levels. But in addition to that, this budget, when it was passed this February in 2025, it actually took an additional step and eliminated congressional earmarks. So what that does is it's actually freed up more money to the SRF for fiscal year 2025, which includes lead service line replacement allocation. So that's a big win for the current year SRF and their funding capacities. With that said, unfortunately, the early outlook for fiscal year 2026 is a bit more concerning. Draft budgets proposed by the executive branch and from EPA itself have proposed a potentially up to 87-89% cut to SRF funding. Essentially, that would end federal support for lead service line replacement programs directly. And while these proposals are expected to face some pushback in Congress, the future is certainly in question for this funding source moving forward. So what impact will all this uncertainty have, and what really could be done right now to potentially mitigate these risks? First, this uncertainty could force SRF programs to make immediate changes and utilize their traditional funding sources and their general allocations to include lead service line replacement projects in that source of funding. And similarly, these programs may also look to preserve a cutout for lead service line replacement programs, but would have to adjust their funding terms and what they're offering to fit within their internal capacities. Overall, if there's a significant cut or removal of funding to the SRF program, there will be significant increases, I think, in competitiveness nationwide. There will now be more applicants that will be pursuing a smaller pot of funding. So what can you do? What can you and your utility do now? The first step is to just develop a comprehensive list of the steps and actions left for your lead service line replacement program. This will assist in identifying what is still needed and what needs to be funded within that. And the next is be proactive. Start right now with funding levels increased for this fiscal year and uncertainty remaining about next year and the future. Applying while the SRF funding is available right now, regardless of where you are in the process, is critical. Additionally, as I went through, evaluate other options. Other funding options exist, like state funding, that WIFIA financing, and potentially even issuing debt will help prepare you for potential changes and understand secondary funding approaches if and when needed. And finally, continue to monitor the EPA and state SRF updates regularly to be in the know about what is to come and be informed about what pivot your program may need to make. Overall, please reach out to me following this with any questions on any of the actions listed here on building strategies, including funding identification and ongoing monitoring, and how we might be able to support you and your utility to meet those funding goals. So thank you, and I believe I will pass it back to Brendan here to take us home.
Yep, thanks, Sean. Let's finish up quick so we have a couple minutes at the end for Q&A. So, Caitlin, you can go to the next slide here. Again, I guess what we saw earlier. So just to summarize, make sure you're reducing your unknowns, your inventory. I think the most important thing is ensuring you have a work order system in place and your crews are capturing that data. Second off, like we've been saying, work with your state regulators for funding. I do know some states are holding webinars, how to access those funds. I know, for instance, Massachusetts just had one last week, very informative webinar. Third on our list here is, consider standing up a daycare and school sampling program. Start hammering out those details. How's your sampling going to get done? Is it going to be a joint effort? Who's going to pay for it? Those are the things you really should start thinking about now. The fourth thing on our list here, consider piloting a first and fifth leader program to see what it does to your 90th percentile level, so it doesn't come as a surprise in 2028. And lastly, make sure you're adding those connectors to your baseline inventory. Just to finish us off, the inventory, it really is the database that feeds all the other elements, especially replacement planning. and funding execution. So it's important to make it as robust as possible. We all know that meeting lead compliance, it's truly a utility-wide coordinated approach. So we're all on this journey together as water providers, engineers, contractors, data analytic companies, so you name it. We all have the same goal in mind of getting you into compliance. So with that, we're going to thank you for attending. I did see some questions come in through the chat, so hopefully a couple minutes here to field those. And thanks, everyone.
That's great. Thank you, team, for sharing insights and addressing those necessary compliance elements in this uncertain landscape. We have received several good questions already, so I'll get started on those, and those that we can't respond to, we will reach out to you to respond to. First one is a two-part question, and Brendan, I'm going to send this over to you. Are the dates for regulatory compliance the same in Canada as in the United States? And secondly, are there any major differences between the jurisdictions?
It's a great question. So this is a strictly US EPA regulation we're discussing here, but I believe Health Canada is the agency. Simon, who's on the line with us, can probably speak to that, but they are completely separate. I do know that some nations wait for the US to make changes and then follow suit after. Simon, can you chime in on what Canada's situation is? You're on mute there.
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me okay, Brendan?
Yep.
Yeah, so like you said, Canada doesn't have like a single federal rule equivalent to LCRI. So in Canada, those regulations, lead regulations, those are managed at the provincial level. But Health Canada provides national guidelines, but those are not enforcing. Those are then considered and may be promulgated at the provincial and territorial level. So with respect to lead service line replacement, that's really happening at the provincial municipal level. So it's really the municipalities, the cities, the towns, they're responsible for identifying and managing lead service lines. And so it's not tied to those same sort of timelines. There are exceptions to that, like if certain municipalities, they have some real challenges with implementing treatment for corrosion control. I've worked with one utility that just had a very large number of groundwater sites, and phosphates at all those sites would have been very prohibitive for the rate base. In those cases, the provincial regulator might step in and hold them to, percent LSL replacement targets, annual targets, kind of similar to what you'd see in the US. But other than that sort of regulatory exemption, it's mostly really just happening in parallel to corrosion control treatment. Those municipalities are doing that replacement, but again, it's not mandated at the federal level, and it's really happening at the municipal level.
Great, thank you both. Caitlin, quick question for you. You mentioned that there are new requirements for the CCR this July, but I'm looking at the fact sheet for when the new language needs to be implemented, and it indicates 2027. So I'm confused. Is it next month, July 2025, or not until 2027?
Yeah, so this is a little bit of a confusing zone for sure. We will drop into the chat here some guidance that went out to just confirm that those elements are needed to be put into your CCR. And I think the guidance that we've found will help clarify that is 2025 in about just 2 weeks.
Thanks.
Yeah, I can add to that quick.
Okay.
There was a document that came out in October of 2024 from the EPA as sort of bridging the gap towards the new requirements in 2027 that are on the fact sheet. So there are additional requirements to be retained. I think Tony just put that in the chat there, so you'll have that at your fingertips.
Great, thanks. And I'm going to take one more question here before we close out. And Sean, this is over to you. When applying for the LSLR funding through the SRF, how do you handle the amount of funding to request if the total amount of lines and total costs are not known at the time of the application?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the nature of this work is kind of dealing with those unknowns. The approach to that is going to change state to state, but ultimately states have built their programs currently to be flexible and be able to handle kind of costs as they come in. So it'll be handled in probably one of a few different ways, but the main two is Applications might be separated out between planning and inventory and then replacement. So when inventory is complete, you'll have that kind of final number, or at least a ballpark and general idea of what the number will be for full replacement. And then, you can have that secondary application go to the SRF for the replacement portion of your program, with kind of a higher priority, given that you've already accessed funding. Or other programs I've seen will accept applications for the known costs as is, and then we'll open up quarterly or monthly or biannual prioritization meetings for their board that will allow you to increase your loan as you go, and as costs continue to build up, or the inventory continues to grow, or replacement needs continue to grow. You'll have a kind of stops along the way to go back to the SRF and say, hey, we need this much more money. They put it in front of their board, and the allocation then kind of moves to your program. So a few different ways to do it, but those tend to be the general ways that states have been handling it.
Or otherwise, you could contact Sean.
Yes, exactly. I'm happy to help and navigate that. It's not always easy.
Great. Thanks, Sean. All right. And with that, we're going to wrap it up today. Thank you, team. And thank you all for your participation. If you have any other questions for our experts here today, their contact info is in the Q&A chat window. You will receive an email within the next 2 weeks with your participation certificate. We will also be posting this presentation on statech.com if you'd like to listen again or share with a colleague. Our next presentation will be on Wednesday, July 23rd, where we will be tackling how to improve asset management and creating a strategic roadmap. We hope you can join us again soon. Thanks all.